Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to this latest edition of the Critical Conversations series on global finance for people and planet. My name is Hiba Ali. I'm the CEO of The New Humanitarian, which is an independent nonprofit newsroom that reports from the heart of humanitarian crises. So our bread and butter is covering people affected by conflicts and disasters. And every day, our journalists see the impact of climate change in countries around the world, from drought in Somalia, where, as we reported, mothers are deliberately making their children sick so that they can take them to government-run health centers for free food, or flooding in Bangladesh, where we met one family that was eating just one meal a day after their community's stores of paddy rice had been submerged. And increasingly, what we're hearing from representatives of crisis-affected communities is that they don't want the international community to send them bags of rice and tarpaulin to help them get through these crises. They want changes to the global financial architecture that lead them to be in need in the first place. And it's clear from our reporting on these crises day in and day out that the unprecedented level of need we're seeing around the world today cannot be met unless the structural roots of these crises are tackled. That is what we are here to talk about today. Across the Commonwealth, leaders of heavily indebted countries, civil society leaders, and those on the front lines of the climate crisis are calling for a systematic reform of the global financial architecture, and in particular, two things: debt restructuring and access to climate financing. Now, listen to this. A recent analysis found that debt-stricken countries have paid a staggering $50 billion in debt repayments to G20 creditors since the pandemic. And almost 50% of countries that are in debt crisis are small, vulnerable Commonwealth member states that are facing severe loss and damage from the warming climate. Rising debt repayments mean that the world's most vulnerable countries, and of course, these are those who have had a negligible role in creating the climate crisis, but are facing the biggest risks from the changing climate, are trapped in a cycle of financial burden. And in the words of Tom Mitchell, the executive director of the International Institute for Environment and Development, which conducted the survey I just alluded to, this means that, quote, money that could be spent protecting people's homes from floods or ensuring their access to water during drought, as well as running schools and hospitals, is instead filling the coffers of big banks and polluters. And we see this in practice. In April, just a few months ago, Kenya's government serviced its debt instead of paying the salaries of civil servants. Next month, the Commonwealth Finance Ministers will be meeting to move forward the discussion on the Commonwealth's call for a new global financial architecture. And so this roundtable today aims to hear and collect the voices of civil society on this topic so that they can inform the finance ministers meeting in October. So for the first hour today, we're going to hear from a few experts on why reform of the global financial architecture is needed, what the recent Paris summit achieved or didn't, and where to go from here. And then we're going to turn to you. And I want to thank each one of you who signed up to be part of this process. We were oversubscribed with well over 900 people keen to join this discussion. And as you know, you were handpicked to be here today. And that's because in the audience, we have a number of experts and practitioners with firsthand experience in climate financing, debt justice, and economic development. So in the second part of the event, we are going to invite contributions from you in the audience to help us formulate recommendations for the finance ministers. Before we start, I'd like to ask each of you to please add your name and organization to your Zoom ID so that we can see who's in the virtual room, so to speak. And that'll also help us identify you when it's time to make your contributions in the second half of the event. And now I'd like to ask our speakers to turn on their videos. We have a really rich mix of folks with us today who add a lot of texture to this discussion. First, you've just seen him turn on his video, Professor Avinash Persaud, the Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on climate finance. He's also the chairman of the Caribbean Communities Commission on the Economy. His career spans finance, public policy, academia, and he is the architect of the now infamous Bridgetown Initiative, which we'll speak about later today. Welcome, Avinash. And you'll also see Dr. Grieve Chilewe, who is an economist from Zambia and an associate professor of political economy at the Africa Institute. Grieve, prior to that, was the director of research at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. Hi, Grieve, and welcome. You'll also find Heidi Chow, the Executive Director of Debt Justice, formerly known as the Jubilee Debt Campaign, which is one of the leading organizations campaigning on debt-related poverty and inequality in solidarity with affected communities in the Global South and across the UK. Hi, Heidi. And last but not least, Unime Gordon is a climate change expert and the former head of the Climate Change Division in Jamaica's Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. She served as the government's focal point to the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where she also functioned as head of delegation and chief negotiator to many COPs. Hi, Unime. And actually, Unime, I'd love to start with you as we jump into the discussion, because Jamaican debt is around 1/5 of government expenditure. Tell us what that does to a country to be so indebted.
Thank you so much, Eva. And I really want to thank the Commonwealth Foundation for just inviting me into this space with this real August panel. Thank you. And you really have set the context very, very clearly in terms of what we are dealing with. I think I'll start with just contextualizing the bane of our existence as a small island developing states, of which Jamaica sits in the middle. And Jamaica debt restructuring story has become a best practice and is well known. But every single year without fail, as we all know, and I'm not going to say anything that anybody in this roundtable doesn't know, but every single year in this region, we are hit by a severe weather event. We just came out of a significant drought. So whether it's a drought, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a tropical storm, this is the bane of our existence. And I think in 1998, if I go back to that far, when we had the most debilitating storm in my lifetime, Hurricane Gilbert, which wiped out 150% of the GDP and the debt spiral. And so we have to, as a country, we have to borrow to develop, we have to borrow to pay the debt. And so this huge debt burden is compounded. It is not only cyclical, but it is a circle. Because if you don't borrow, you can't pay the debt. If you don't borrow, you can't develop. If you don't develop, you can't pay the debt. So this cyclical nature of this debt burden is what we find ourselves, and then this spiraling. What really does this do to us? You can't develop education, you can't develop sectorally, there's really no development. And in this era of climate change, where we are landing everything on the table of climate change, this is what climate change does to our development. It is intricately linked. There is absolutely no development taking place. How do we feed the poor and the vulnerable then? How do we finance education? These are questions that we ask. How do we even keep our people healthy? What do we do about healthcare? And how really do we meaningfully adapt and build resilience? These are questions that we continue to ask. Jamaica debt burden has been, we were, I think, 150% of our GDP. And basically what Jamaica did in the last, I think, couple of years, developed this risk financing policy. We started to look at fiscal risk and therefore start to peel back these risks, the fiscal risk, the transition risk, all those risks, and then started to systematically develop pillars of existence around those fiscal risks. We've been able, as you know, to take that down to, I think we are now at 80% of GDP over the last 5 years. But it came with pain to the population, and a really, really very painful austerity measures, entering the IMF programs, making sure that what we call here in the Caribbean, the belts were tightened, just so that we were able to build down the debt, build the fiscal resilience. Jamaica probably is one of the first countries who, despite not being a perfect mechanism, but issued a cat bond and invested in a catastrophic bond, which we floated just to make sure that this cyclical nature of the climate event does not take us on. So that fiscal responsibility and that fiscal tightening, I think, is what we as a country can be proud of, as a people, as a government, as a nation. Not there yet, but I think it is steps in the right direction. But as I said at the beginning, it is the bane of our existence, where we are hit every year.
Yeah.
Not out of the hurricane season yet, not out of any of the disasters. Yesterday when I came home, torrential rains, another set of floodings, another set in communities. How really do we build that systematic resilience? Is basically what this is all about. And it matching the development agenda with the climate agenda and moving along in one trajectory, I think, is where the discussion.
As really poignant picture there,
that's yes. So
thank you for but thanks for grounding us in the reality of what you're facing day to day, because it's very easy to get into technical discussions on these issues, but it's helpful to remember what it's all about. You mentioned the IMF programs that you had to go through to get the debt down, and I want to turn to you, Grief, because you are a critic of the World Bank and the IMF, the principal institutions for global lending, and there's a lot of talk right now of reforming these IFIs. Talk us through, I mean, perhaps we all know the track record of international financial institutions in crafting policies that are pro-poor, but what do you see as the alternatives to their loan conditions if we're trying to kind of reimagine what's wrong with the current system and what could be turned to instead?
Heba, thanks a lot. I also want, like my colleague, co-panelist, Ms. Gordon, I want to say gratitude to the Commonwealth Foundation for having me here as a speaker. The question you ask is an important one. I'm Zambian, so I think at the present moment, alongside Jamaica, Zambia, Sri Lanka, and many other countries in the South, they're in the midst of a debt crisis, yet again, in the midst of a debt crisis, which means we keep going through this crisis every now and then, which means there's something wrong with the global financial architecture, something structurally wrong, something that you said, Heba, in your introduction. It's a structural issue. It is not something that is facile, something that's on the surface. It's a structural issue. So the standard prescription for countries that are going through a debt crisis has been austerity, as Ms. Gordon just shared with us in the case of Jamaica. And often this austerity is austerity on the poor, because the poor are a section of our society, even though they're in the majority, they tend to have the least amount of power to organize, to mobilize, and so on and so forth. So often when the IMF calls for austerity, which is to say, cut down expenditure, cut down government expenditure, cut down fiscal expenditure, often that cutting down will fall on the poor. It will fall on things like education, healthcare, agriculture, subsidies to transportation, subsidies to energy, the kind of things that are important for the poor, right? The kind of things without which the poor are really, really in trouble. And often the benefits, right? So often, austerity will say, cut down expenditure on the one hand. On the other hand, we need to stimulate the economy, given that the economy is in a crisis. And to do that, we need to have some tax cuts, right? But those tax cuts do not accrue to the poor. Those tax cuts often accrue to the well-off, again, because the well-off have power, they're in a position to organize, to mobilize, and so on and so forth. So this has been the standard prescription that the IMF and other IFIs have always inflicted on the poor countries when those countries are in moments of crisis. Rather than giving assistance to those countries, rather than giving those countries assistance, financial flows, often the reverse is what is done, right? Inflict pain on them, which means you're setting them up to again be indebted a couple of years down the line, which is completely in opposition to what we see in the West, for example. When a financial entity in the West or the economy is in crisis, you often see the reverse, right? You often see ramping up expenditure, what is called fiscal expansionary expenditures happened in the US during COVID and so on and so forth. So I think Heba, this is the fundamental criticism of how the IFIs like to resolve sovereign debt crises in poor countries. The prescription is always a bitter pill of austerity, which never works, which often falls on the poor, which often consigns the poor into further poverty, which often consigns those countries into further dependence and poverty, setting them up again for another debt crisis down the line. So it's not a fundamental structural reform, which allows them, to be better prepared to grow, to develop, to rely less on debt, but actually to be much more dependent on debt in the ways
is there an alternative to that model?
This is the work that we need to do, right? I think the whole idea of we need to rethink the role of the IMF. Maybe we need a new type of international organization that is supposed to perform the principles of what the IMF was set out to perform. But I think it is not controversial to say it here that the IMF hasn't done that job pretty well, right?
So, Avinash, I see you, I don't know how to describe the expression on your face right now, but reacting in some form. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you are the architect of a new proposal called the Bridgetown Initiative that attempts, as I see it, to provide an answer to the challenges that Unime and Grieve just laid out in terms of the problems with the current system. So walk us through how you see it solving some of the challenges that have been laid out.
And these are grave and complicated issues. They are no simple silver bullets. And when, as Jamaica and Barbados and Zambia, when we have debt that exceeds a multiple of our national income, they're not a huge number of options. An option cannot be even more debt. So the options are limited, but we can do much better, as Grieve said. So I think there are 3 or 4 main challenges we're trying to deal with. One of the things I've learned in public policy is you've got to start off with identifying what is the problem you're trying to solve. And we have like 3 major problems. The world has used up 85% of its carbon budget already, and the rich countries have used up the vast majority of that. And that's how they got rich. The problem is that the last 15%, the developing world is now using up a lot of that pretty fast. So whilst the rich countries bear the greatest responsibility, one of our challenges is there's no solution, there's no pathway that doesn't involve developing countries also accelerating a green transformation faster than the rich countries did. And so that's one of our big challenges. How do we do that? The second thing is that we can jump up and down about the injustice, the iniquity, the immorality of the financial system. But we deal on the other side of the table, as Unime knows well, with governments. And those governments have been elected. And they're not being elected by people saying, send more money to the global south. They're getting elected by people saying that we should send less money to the global south, that we should not send money to foreigners, we should be deporting foreigners. That's how these people are being elected. So you've got to be very conscious of the world we're in. We need civil society to speak with a loud voice about the immorality and iniquities. But people like Unime and I have to deal with the reality that if we want to deliver for our people this year, next year, the year after, then we have to deal with the governments across the table. And ODA budgets are not going up. They're about $200 billion a year. For climate transformation, we need $2.4 trillion. We need 12 times more than the ODA budget. And the ODA budget is going nowhere towards that 12 times. It's not even going up. It appears to be going up, but it's being double counted. It's being siphoned off Ukraine humanitarian assistance, which is necessary, but that should have been additional money, not existing money. So, we have those challenges. The other big problem we have is that the fair amount of climate change is already baked into the system. And, the rich countries are suffering from the most awful flooding and heat waves. But of course, the poor are suffering 4 times more than that. And that's not a speculative number. That's the IPCC has estimated that between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, which is what we call the tropics, the cost of existing climate change is 4 times greater. So these countries that didn't cause this thing are suffering 4 times greater. So that's the other big challenge. And our solution is really basically threefold. We're saying if we need $2.4 trillion, we need to break this down. And we need to break it down with different types of finance that can achieve this. So about half of what we need is stuff that generates money. Solar farms make money. Wind turbines make money. So we need to find a way of unblocking private investment in those things. And those private investors are not coming to the south. They're going to the north. They're not coming to the south because of the imbalanced global financial system that Guy was talking about earlier. It's a system of core and periphery, and the periphery is more volatile, and the cost of capital, and that's a result of the system, the cost of capital is very, very high. So we need to unblock the flow of capital by reducing the cost of capital. And I promise you I'm going to end very shortly. The other big thing we need to do is we need to get a massive increase in the multilateral development banks. They have become irrelevant in their size. They need to be 3 times bigger than they are. And they can get 3 times bigger without anyone putting in a huge amount of money. They can get 3 times bigger by them using their existing capital. They're very conservative. The minute you become a development banker, you enjoy saying no to poor countries. So they're lending very little. They're very defensive. They need to lend 3 times more. And the rich countries can guarantee some of their capital. My final point would be, we can get the private sector doing mitigation. We can get the development banks doing adaptation in climate vulnerable countries. And we need a definition of climate vulnerability that they can get concessional money, because we can't pay back this amount of debt if it's on normal terms. 50% of the increase of our debt relates to climate change and natural disasters. But the final thing, which we can't get the private sector to do, we can't get the development banks to do, is financing for loss and damage when we have a climate disaster. That has to be grants. And the ODA budgets aren't big enough. So we need new revenue sources, new taxes and levies on emissions, global taxes and levies emissions, falling the hardest on the well-off, which will be helping to finance loss and damage. And that's bridged down. The private sector for climate mitigation, the development banks for adaptation with very long-term concessionary money, because poor countries don't have the space for more debt. And loss and damage has got to be grants. Can't be insurance, can't be borrowing, got to be grants from new emissions-related taxes.
So there's obviously a lot there to unpack, and what strikes me off the bat is that you were talking about investing more in the institutions that Grief says he no longer believes that are capable of doing the job. So that's one thing we can maybe...
What's the alternative? What's the alternative? New institutions, which would need new capital. Who's going to put in that capital? They would need more capital than the existing ones because they'll have to earn their credibility. The World Bank has lent $800 billion over almost 100 years with $20 billion of capital. They've only ever had $20 billion, and they've lent $800 billion. Let's make
Grief, do you have an answer to that? Is there an alternative?
Let's make them better. I'm not saying they're great. They've made many, many mistakes. The IMF has made many, many mistakes, but making sure that they make less mistakes in the future, as opposed to starting from scratch, seems to be the easier route.
I think, look, I mean, it's an interesting question. Is it reform or we start anew? I think in many ways, perhaps we're in a post-1945 moment. I can imagine There were people who thought the League of Nations could still do the job, but we had to rethink the League of Nations. We had to come with the United Nations. I mean, my point is to say, look, the World Bank and the IMF, particularly the IMF, in as far as dealing with crisis, has done a terrible job. And I think saying they've done a terrible job is putting it charitably. I mean, they've cost lives. There are studies that detail this, that austerity costs lives. And I think it's important for us to really confront the question, is it the IMF? Is it something different? Can the IMF escape its geopolitical traps? The IMF is trapped in geopolitical fights. I mean, the shareholding of the IMF, the way the IMF makes decisions, the governorship, the corporate governance of the IMF, all these things, I think, are things that trap the IMF in some type of bad equilibrium trap. And I think it's worth asking ourselves the question, do we need something new? And this is why a lot of people from my part of the world are very excited, for example, about the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, right? Now, obviously, the BRICS Bank has a whole long way to go in terms of raising capital, the ways that Avinash just described. But the arrival of the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, has gotten many people excited precisely because we've lost all sort of confidence in the World Bank. And it's also used, I'm on Avinash's side here. I mean, the World Bank has not always been like this, right? There was a time when the World Bank financed a very important dam in Zambia in the 50s. And I'm sure they did that in many other parts of the world. But that kind of ambitious, imaginative, long-term type of financing at lower levels of interest has, for some reason, gone away from the World Bank, and I don't know if it can come back again. But that's essentially the context, Heba.
Yeah, no, I think the context is clear.
Can I give an example of the issue?
Really quickly, Avinash, because then I want Heidi's reactions to this debate.
Yeah, I mean, when we went to the IMF, and I was one of the lead negotiators for our IMF program, I went with basically Greaves' mindset. Right, they'd had a terrible history, and indeed, I was one of the consultants for the Independent Evaluation Office, which did the work to show what a terrible history they had. But we decided that we were going to go to them with our austerity plan, which was the most shared restructuring plan that has ever existed. Labour was not going to take the 100% of the cut; they were going to take 1/3 of the cut. We were raising taxes on the rich; they took another third of the cut. And our creditors took the other third, a third. It was a shared adjustment program. Now, we were able to do that because we had 2 years to plan. Countries in crisis go to the IMF without any ability to plan. They haven't had the time. And the IMF imposes a standard sort of theocracy approach to this thing. But that's not our example is that there is an alternative. It requires countries to perhaps help each other with the help to design the plans. We say to anyone who has our situation, I say, you should go to the IMF, and we're happy to talk to you about what we did. And Jamaica, I'm sure, will do the same thing too. So there are lessons that we can learn from and get a better IMF than we have today.
Okay, so it's clear everyone agrees that the reimagination of the institutions is necessary. Now, whether that happens through making them better or coming up with an alternative is cause for debate. But Heidi, from your vantage point, what else should we be thinking about as we kind of reimagine the global financial architecture, and particularly coming back to where Unime started in terms of how you write off debt in a way that is fair and sustainable for the countries involved? What else should we have on the table as we look to the options for the future? You're on mute, Heidi. Sorry.
Just say thank you, Heather, and again, thank you to the Commonwealth Foundation for inviting me into this space. I think we've had already quite a good discussion about the role of the IMF and World Bank, and I just want to slightly chip in on that, if I may, but just to quickly say that, because actually what we see happening to the IMF and World Bank is actually a little bit of replay of history of what's happening now in terms of the debt crisis we're seeing being played out now. So, for example, the IMF and World Bank were originally set up with the idea that the World Bank would invest in development projects. The IMF would help with temporary crisis. And then what happened in the 1980s was that both these institutions were then kind of re-engineered for a whole new kind of global north control over global south countries. So as countries got into a debt crisis because of lots of reckless lending that happened in the 1970s, a lot of it driven by Cold War politics, we saw that these two institutions re-engineered to then give out, to bail out the private lenders who lent recklessly, and then the debts were then transferred to the IMF and the World Bank. And so then in the 1990s, we saw a big sort of global jubilee movement for debt cancellation, which my organization finds its origins in. And then by 2005, we saw a massive debt cancellation of $130 billion worth of debt wiped off for lots of lower income countries. But actually what had happened was that we transferred that debt, the debt repayments away from the private creditors, so they got all their money back. And then in the end, it was the international financial institutions that had to take the hit, as it were, in terms of cancelling those debts. And we're seeing a little bit of that play out now in the current context that we're in. So we see 54 countries currently in a debt crisis. And debt levels are, in fact, at their highest levels now in 25 years. And I think Una May set out really clearly the harsh reality of what it's like to be on the front lines of both the debt and the climate crisis. And that kind of vicious cycle between those two, but also between the debt and climate crisis, and also the connection between a country wanting to build resilient economies. And so countries that are in that debt crisis are struggling, seeing falling and stagnating public spending, and actually at a time where countries actually need to be increasing public spending in order to reduce poverty and to achieve their development goals. And also to deal with the multiple crises of debt and climate and the rising costs of food and fuel. And the problem with the debt crisis is that these unsustainable debts are undermining the ability of governments to be able to deliver essential public services like healthcare and education, and addressing the climate crisis. And in fact, lower income countries are now spending 5 times more on debt repayments than they are addressing the impacts of the climate crisis.
So Heidi, what do you think should be done about that? How do you change that structure?
A real blockage to seeing debt restructuring take place in the global economy right now is actually the role of private lenders. So almost half of all debt repayments are owed to private lenders, but we have no mechanism in place at the moment in our global financial architecture to bring them to the table to negotiate debt restructuring. And we might come on to this a little bit later when we talk a little bit about the case of Zambia, where we've seen actually the private lenders are still holding out. So even though there's a deal that's been reached with other government lenders, actually there is no deal right now with private lenders. So we do need to see stronger mechanisms to enforce them, to compel them to come to the table to negotiate debt restructuring. And so we really need, so essentially, we need we can't, if we're talking about global financial architecture, we can't ignore the role that debt plays dealing with those very current debt crises that we're seeing in our world right now that's affecting so many countries.
Very interesting and clear recommendation there, not to ignore the private creditors. And I had seen some commentary some time back about how, in all this talk of reform, the group of people that is most neglected in the discussion is asset managers, who have and wealth managers who have a huge role to play in all of this. So very interesting. I want to turn now to the Paris Summit for a new global financing pact, because this was much heralded as a moment in which to tackle these challenges that we've been talking about. World leaders met in June with the mandate to address a kind of fairer deal between the global North and the global South that would help solve the debt crisis as well as the climate crisis. Avinash, from your perspective, to why I think I know that you believe it was an important milestone. So why is that? How did the Paris Summit help make progress towards this vision of global financial architecture reform?
Sure, important point. I just say one word though about debt and debt defaulting. Nothing stops us. We defaulted. Nothing stops you defaulting on private creditors. We got elected on May 25th, announced the following week we were in default on all of our debt, and we shaved them by 30%. Now, the only way you can default on private creditors, if you need to borrow money in the future, is if you go into an IMF program. And so the real obstacle is making sure these IMF programs are locally owned and are sustainable politically as well as economically. Now, I think our three key goals on the Paris summit was we wanted to find a mechanism that will drive private sector investment into the green transformation in the South. And so that's why one of the things that we agreed to at Paris was the idea of a partial foreign exchange guarantee for investments in green transformation projects to try and deal with this very asymmetrical financial system where foreign exchange volatility and uncertainty is stopping investors going. We also agreed to a $200 billion target for the increase of lending by the MDBs. Now, 12 months ago, nobody would have said we're going to increase lending by 20 billion, far less $200 billion over 10 years. Now, I think that $200 billion is still far too low. And we're campaigning for that number to be much higher. That may be 1/5 of where we need to go, but we were nowhere before. And we just have announced yesterday, because in Paris we said, and you know what? In addition to them sweating their capital, they need to add new capital. Everyone was against that. Yesterday, the UK government, this UK government of all governments, announced that they would now consider increasing capital for the World Bank. That was completely off the table 12 months ago. So we're seeing changes on putting more capital and expanding the lending of the MDBs. And then the final thing on loss and damage. Our point about it has to be non-debt. Countries with suffering loss and damage are hugely indebted today. The last thing they want is even a concessional loan. They can't pay back loans. Every time they get hit by disaster, they'll be sinking under oceans of debt before the sea levels rise up. And so the notion of it being non-debt. So there was at Paris a support by 22 countries after a carbon emissions tax for shipping, $100 per carbon of emissions, of a ton of carbon emissions on all shipping. Now, we need a range of these types of taxes. We need a methane leakage tax. We need that the carbon border adjustment tax, that revenues from that get sent to developing countries through the loss and damage fund. So we need a range of these things. 22 countries agreed to it. We didn't get it passed at the IMO. The number of countries at the IMO said that this would fall on poor countries as well as rich countries. And so at the moment, we're trying to redesign the shipping tax so it's more proportionately falling on rich countries and rich consumers rather than poor. But I would say we got three things. We got an expanded MDB lending, a commitment to expand it further, consider more capital. We got mechanisms for unblocking private capital, and we got a commitment to look for these new revenue streams and a push on a shipping tax to begin with. Clearly, a lot more needs to be done, but none of those three things were on the agenda. We also got one of my favorite things is the Barbados-style natural disaster clauses in all bonds. All the development banks are now lining up to say we want to have these two. We actually want to put them in a private. Back to this links my endpoint links with our earlier discussion. When we restructured our private debt, we put natural disaster clauses in all of the new debt. So whenever there's a disaster, there is a 2-year freeze on interest payments and principal payments. We believe that that's one of the ways of changing, reforming the global financial system, making it more shock absorbing. This should be not just in the MDB debt, in the development bank debt. It should also be in private debt. It should be everywhere. It's one thing because ultimately it doesn't reduce your debt. It just changes your payments. We also need to find other solutions, but that is an important thing. And the development banks lined up in Paris to announce they were going to follow the same thing.
So quite a lot to celebrate in what you've just outlined. And as you say, a lot of these things you had been fighting for. So that's positive. Heidi, I want to come back to you. I suspect you're among those who feel that the commitments at the Paris summit fell short of the kind of transformational change that was hoped for. And I was just reading through the roadmap that came out of the summit, and there was a lot of language like G20 partners should make further progress on ... or should strengthen efforts towards ... which of course, are not really measurable or concrete targets. So what's your assessment of the achievements that came out of Paris?
Thank you, Hiba. Yeah, I think that going into the summit, civil society groups from across the global south were calling for, and really excited about the potential of a summit which was based on the transformation of the world's financial system. And we're calling for things like new resources to tackle the climate crisis. They're calling for stronger, more enforceable mechanisms for debt restructuring. And, it was this level of ambition that was needed to address the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And the roadmap, we feel, just fell short of that rhetoric and that expectation, and offering very little that can actually address the scale of the challenge that's ahead of us. When it comes to addressing the debt crisis, we need to strengthen international processes to ensure fair, responsive debt relief. And we also need to see commitments on grant-based climate financing. And instead, the proposals on the table, some of them are small steps forward. They might be helpful in some circumstances, but essentially it really lacked the kind of scale of ambition that was set out at the start. So, for example, on debt, there was the roadmap includes mention of debt swaps, which might be helpful in some circumstances, but not sufficient on their own to address the scale of the debt crisis across the global south. These climate resilient debt clauses, disaster resilient debt clauses that Avinash has just mentioned, these are helpful for future crises, because they only apply to new debt. And I guess on their own, they're a good step forward, but they're not going to help the current crisis. And again, even in the future, actually, these are only suspensions we're talking about, rather than a complete creation of a robust debt restructuring system for the world. And then when it comes to mobilizing funds on the climate crisis, we're concerned that the discussions were really focused on this idea of new loans to the global south, which we worry that risks, will exacerbate the debt crisis while also doing nothing to actually fix the debt crisis. So new loans will end up being used to repay existing creditors. So kicking the can down the road, but also ensuring that, like I mentioned before, that it's the private creditors that get bailed out by these new loans. And in the end, in the long term, what you're doing is creating incentives in a system where reckless lending gets rewarded. So we're worried that these kinds of measures ends up exacerbating the debt crisis while not actually generating new funds to address the climate crisis. Now, to make a real difference to the debt crisis that we're seeing right now, we need to see improvements to the G20 common framework. And this is a debt initiative, the debt restructuring initiative that was set up over 3 years ago in response to the pandemic, to enable the lowest income countries to access debt restructuring. But this initiative has failed to deliver the quick and the fair debt relief that's needed, while excluding countries that are in a debt crisis from actually accessing the process. And so the roadmap does include steps and to provide more clarity around the process and the timescales. But the key problem is that the G20 has not included the one big step that would actually make a difference, and that is to include a mechanism to compel private creditors to participate. And just to kind of respond to Avinash's earlier point about you can just default on private creditors, which countries can do. But first of all, private creditors could potentially sue countries that are in default through the courts, or through the jurisdiction of which their debt contracts are written in, normally in the UK courts or the New York courts. And secondly, actually, countries that default are often seen as pariah states. They're seen as they're ostracized by the global community. So I think countries should be able to default with their private creditors, but they need the financial and political support from institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the global north and the wealthy countries to be able to remain in default. Because that's right, if they are unable to pay their debts, they shouldn't be diverting resources away from meeting the basic needs of their people towards lining wealthy creditors in the global north. So I think these are some of the areas that I feel like where we were quite disappointed in the outcome with the Paris summit.
And you mentioned earlier the case of Zambia, and I wanted to turn to you, Grieve, because it is a bit of a case study also in reference to the common framework that you just cited, Heidi. It was actually, and Avinash, you didn't mention it, but it was also seen to be one of the big achievements of the Paris summit, the announcement of a debt restructuring deal for Zambia. And in 2020, it was the first African country to default on its sovereign debt. And after 2.5 painful, as I understand them, years of negotiation, you reached what is deemed a very historic agreement for more than $6 billion in Zambian debt to be rescheduled, and for a grace period to kick off. So this should be seen, I suppose, as a success, but you're quite critical of this deal. So why?
Well, the first thing is I want to say a little bit about the Paris summit, because just to point out the irony that, in West Africa, there's a bunch of countries whose monetary policy is controlled by France. I think you're head of the CFA franc. So it's quite ironical that Paris, the sit where many of these countries in West Africa have to route their monetary policy through, hosted this summit to reform the global financial architecture. I just want to point out that irony. So I find it very interesting in my. Now, coming to the issue of the debt restructuring deal that was announced in Paris with regards to Zambia, I'm not critical. It's important to say it is not a deal that I'm critical of, because that is a good news. It was excellent news. As you pointed out, Heba, we waited for this deal for two years and some months. And you can imagine a country that is highly indebted, a country that in many ways has been shut out of the global financial system, the uncertainties that come with your debt not being resolved in quick time, right? Our currency in this 2-year period has gone out of whack, which means the cost of imports have gone up, which means the cost of petrol, the cost of electricity, the cost of commodities has gone up. And it is in this time period that we've had an IMF program, which has also required much, much more austerity. So you can imagine what the lives of the typical Zambian has been like in this period of uncertainty. I think to Heidi's point, that what we do need at this point is like timeous resolution of crises such as Zambia's. We had, I think a couple of months ago, we had the Silicon Valley Bank in the US, a bank that went belly up, threatened the financial health of the US and large parts of the global economy. You saw how quickly that crisis was resolved, right? This in many ways is the kind of action, the kind of speedy response that I think we should demand from the IMF. This is the kind of very quick, the IMF or the global multilateral system, if it is to be truly a global multilateral system that is fair, that's quick, that's just, we want this crisis resolved quickly. And I think, so that's the point of contention for me. Not the deal is a good thing. I mean, obviously it's glass half empty. Heidi has made the point that the private creditors, we as yet haven't struck a deal, the private creditors. And as I study the reaction in Zambia among its financial markets, we see that the uncertainty is coming back. For example, the Zambian kwacha has depreciated against the US dollar. The depreciation keeps to be going up, even in the midst of this debt deal. So the financial markets, what people call smart money, is also quite skeptical. It is a deal, it's good news, glass half empty, but it's not the entirety of the story. So I think that's useful to point out those kinds of nuances, Heba. I'm not critical of the deal. We needed this kind of relief, but it came late. And I wonder whether it is too late. And
when we spoke beforehand, you said something to the effect of, who is this deal really serving? What's your answer to that question?
I mean, to be honest, we can't shy away from the fact that the world is gripped by geopolitical struggles and geopolitical repositioning that we haven't seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think this is not a controversial statement to make. And it seems to us, or at least it seems to me, that even though the deal was good for Zambia, it came late, but it was good for Zambia. It's some relief, not enough. But this deal and the announcement of the deal and the way it was announced was a big coup for the global multilateral system in many ways that is Western dominated. This was a good deal for the IMF, the World Bank, and the Old Boys Club. It was great because it proved, at least to them, that the global the global multilateral system, even though it needs some tinkering around the edges, still works, right? But I think in many ways, for some of us, I think the fact that it took 2 years is itself evidence that this global multilateral system that's Western dominated needs to change. There's need for reform there. So that's the point. That's the point that I made earlier.
Uname, I see you smiling and nodding your head, and I'm, there's a clear tension here between Avinash, the person who's trying to kind of work with the world as it exists today, and Grieve, who, you know, would like to see a different world altogether. And you, I imagine, as someone who has been part of negotiating teams at COP, kind of understand that difficult balancing act that you need in diplomacy to get anything done. So what's the right balance to your mind in terms of the way forward in pushing for these kinds of changes?
You know, I'm bowing and nodding because for the first time in all of this, I am seeing the development agenda and the economics colliding somewhere in the conversation. There is really a great collision happening here. And so the Paris summit itself, as I said, and there is really no criticism because I think the bar was really moved in terms of where we need to go, and it has moved the conversation. But I really think the language in the roadmap, if that's where we're going, it was so non-binding, and everything could contribute or could be discussed or could be made or could include, which was really so non-binding. And while I think it was a great, almost good for Zambia, I agree with you that it was really a coup for the system. Something had to come out. And in all of these, I remember the first Paris summit, I was also part of that in terms of preparing the government to participate in that. There needs to be a coup somehow to move the bar. So I think the marbles moved. So for me, while I think the Paris summit and the Bridgetown agenda, I think really that the conversation around financing and the financial architecture is still not landing to the people who needs it, the people and the country who needs it most. And I think as I look, I'm a development officer and Avi is an economist. And therefore, where we need this to land is where the people and the countries that are involved, the climate vulnerable countries. So the conversation is still up there. And my fear at this time, while I'm smiling so much, is that this architecture that we're building, I probably can liken it to a cathedral that we're building. And the people are still missing in the cathedral. So we'll have this fantastic cathedral at the end of the day, which is this new financial architecture, which we have been pushing for since the first climate summit in 2019, if you remember. But at the end of the day, lives are still being lost and people are still suffering. And so as a development professional, this is my fear. But as I said, and as Gabe said, not a criticism. I think the bar has been moved, but we need more binding commitment that this is going to happen. And we have faith in people like Avi and the Prime Minister of Barbados that they will push the bar to ensure that this happens.
Thanks, Unime. And we're going to come back to the four of you in just a minute for some thoughts on what should be prioritized moving forward. But in the meantime, I want to turn to the audience for a few of their recommendations. And again, a reminder that this is in the view of the Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting that's happening in October in Morocco, in the wings of the IMF's annual meeting, where they do have a specific focus on mechanisms to tackle the effects of climate change, elevating debt in order to build resilient economies, finding new sources of finance, accessing climate funds, et cetera, very much in line with everything we've been discussing. So we've heard from Avinash in particular, that the needs are huge, and estimates on the spending for climate change are about 2.4 trillion needed per year by 2030. So we want to hear from you. How do you think this can be achieved, and what should be prioritized? A report of this roundtable will summarize the discussions, the key findings, the proposed recommendations, and be shared with the finance ministers and other stakeholders. And outcomes will also feed into the next Commonwealth People's Forum and Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2024. So I'm going to start turning to some of you in the audience, and we'll be sharing a document on screen that helps document a bit of what we're hearing. Again, what steps or actions do you think Commonwealth Finance Ministers should focus on as they tackle reform of the global financial system in order to address the twin challenges of climate change and development? And first, I'm going to turn, and please forgive me if I've pronounced anyone's names wrong, to Christine Samwaru. And you can unmute yourself and go ahead and share your thoughts.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I'm not able to turn my screen on, but I'll keep trying. I'm just grateful for the conversation, and I must agree with the representative from Trinidad. I am actually joining from Guyana. I have an NGO that work at the intersection of gender and environmental justice. And listening to this conversation, I keep asking myself, where do we fit the people in? Where do we fit our grassroots people in, the people that I work in, the young people, Indigenous people, people with disability? When we talk about finance, where exactly are we fitting these people in? And I hope that we are building, when we're building these institutions, that we're taking these people into consideration, because for too long, we have left them out. And this conversation around finance has been something above our heads that only people in fancy institutions and governments have been a part of. So my concern is, where do we fit the people on the ground, the people that are most affected by the climate crisis and the other social justice issues that come with the climate crisis? Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And next, we're going to hear from Owen, I believe, Owen Tudor.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm speaking from the Commonwealth Trade Union Group, which represents 70 million workers around the Commonwealth in over 40 countries. I think there's been a lot of very positive proposals made by the panelists, but one that I thought hasn't been raised yet, which I think might be something that finance ministers could take up. We've got, I'm conscious of the irony here, we've got a Paris Club of creditor nations that gets together and works out what to do about debt. I'm not aware that we've got a debtors club. I'm not sure which country, which capital you could call it after, maybe Bridgetown. But there's no debtors club that pulls together those countries which have got these debt problems and need to exchange experience about what's working, and perhaps actually develop some collective responses to this. Now, there are 10 Commonwealth countries which have a debt to GDP ratio of over 100%. Actually, at least 3 of them are actually in the Paris Club of creditor nations, because debt is not just a problem for developing nations, but if the Commonwealth could put together, the Commonwealth Finance Ministers could take the initiative in bringing together those nations which in the Commonwealth which have problems with debt, either they're in debt distress or heading in that direction, then that would be a really useful collective decision of Commonwealth Finance Ministers.
Very concrete proposal. Thank you, Owen. And we've got that jotted down. Franca Acu, I'd love to hear your recommendation.
Okay, so I like the last speaker's concept of the debtors club. I believe that a lot of the nations, or virtually all the nations who are in debt crisis, are nations that have been highly exploited by the global north. We have had our resources taken away. We have been robbed, as it were. And so I find it interesting that once in a while, these people turn around and they say, okay, we're going to help you. We're going to forgive your debt. I just believe that we really need to probably think in terms of the debtors coming together. Let's even have a table. What is owed to you and what have you taken from us? I feel we need to sit down and call for accounts of some sort. Because it's such an unjust word. And if we're talking about debt justice, we need to begin to look at it from the concept of equity. You know, I'm not sure how much has been done in this direction, because there was a time there was a lot of talk about reparation, restitution. They have a way of making us go, just exhaust your energy, and when you're ready to talk, come to us. And so they give Zambia some debt relief. I think it is so insignificant compared to what they have taken from us, the exploitation, the extraction. So I just believe that maybe this debtors club is a good idea. Let's come together and say, okay, on the paper, we owe you this, but let's see what you have taken from us. And then we'll probably arrive at some understanding as to who is really owing who. I mean, that's the only way I see it. We need to talk about issues of coloniality, the continuing exploitation of various nations in the South. We need to talk about all of that before we can talk about debt justice. Thank you.
I mean, and certainly the discussion around loss and damage has been framed through the lens of reparations, but there's a broader reparations discussion, of course, that can be had. And actually, I host a podcast called Rethinking Humanitarianism. And in the last season, we dedicated all the episodes to reimagining global governance. And Avinash was on talking about the Bridgetown Initiative, but we also had an episode about reparations for colonialism. And actually, there are some precedents for this, and it's not as far-fetched as it's sometimes presented to be. And in the same way that reparations in the U.S. have been, calculated, and compensation has been, there's been a lot of work done to determine exactly how much is owed. I think many are thinking about what would a reparations index look like, in which what is owed for colonialism is also taken into account. You could, of course, have that across many categories for climate change, et cetera. But very interesting recommendation, Franca. Thank you. Nadisha Lenkandikara, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm audible enough, isn't it?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, all the resource persons today here, because this is timely needed topic you all are discussed. And actually, I'm from Sri Lanka. I think most of you may know about our country's situation, economic situation, current situation. So we all are facing a huge debt and economic crisis at the moment. So as my recommendations, I would like to suggest that in terms of while I'm having the experiences in my own country, I felt that most of the time in my country, once I get my country's situation, I noted down that accountability and transparency of the institutional arrangement in a country is a most important thing that we need to rethink, because at the moment, the economic situation in our country is so bad. So the main reason behind this economic situation is the corruptions behind the scene of all the politicians and all the government institutions and maybe the private sector institutions. They all are doing some kind of corruptions in a hidden hand. But at the end, all the country, all the people, including a young generation to the older generation, all people, we all are suffering a lot of huge crises at the moment. And at the same time, I felt that institutional integration and collaboration is needed, and it is a must. And at the same time, the awareness among the people, because in my country, most of the rural area people, they might not known about what's going on in this country, and they just only worrying about how to get their food and how to get their necessary things in a daily life, and they don't much more having knowledge about the whole country situation at the moment. So I just feel that people actually need to aware about the country's economic situation at the moment. And at the same time, the responsibilities, actually this is a very much lacking part when I considering about my country's situation. Although there are lots of private government institutions, there are lots of institutions around the country to have some kind of an contribution to the country's the country's government, but at the same time they even don't know what are their own responsibilities. So maybe that is one of the causes to having such kind of a debt crisis at the moment in my country. And as a young planner, so I'm a junior urban planner, so I felt that due to this economic crisis, it does not only impact for the economy of the country, but as a country, for social, economic, and environmental, all these sectors are really impacted due to this bad situation. Most of the young generation leave the country, so that's a bad and really sad situation at the moment. So those are some kind of a recommendation that I would wanted to make. And thank you all the resource person, and thank you Commonwealth organization to organize this wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadisha. And a helpful reminder, I think, when we talk about all this, that there is also responsibility at the national government level, and that it can't all be blamed on international forces. I'm going to turn to Neil Kamel and then come back to the panel for a few of their recommendations and then come back to the audience. So Neil, over to you.
Yeah, as Mr. Avinash was talking about the need of $2.4 trillion as climate finance, what the word mainly the global south is waiting for the disbursal of promised $100 billion. We need from the finance ministers to follow the start made by UK Prime Minister Mr. Rishi Sunak at the just concluded G20 meeting, where he announced to provide $2 billion to Global Climate Fund. So my recommendation is that all the Commonwealth and developed nations to come forward in committing funds for climate, and at least earmark a figure as climate finance, and must stick to that words. So these words must not remain as hollow, as we have been seeing earlier, as these commitments were made at the Paris Agreement, during the Paris Agreement, and it was to start from 2020. But now we are in 2023, and still the promised $100 billion has not started. So we just want from the finance minister that whatever is committed, that should be made a reality, and the finance should be at least as per the needs of the global south and those countries which are not historical emitters and which need a fund to come to the towns. Thank you so much.
You remind me, Neil, of something I heard another climate justice activist say the other day. She was citing a study at the University of Leeds that found that wealthy countries owe $170 trillion in reparations for their excessive carbon emissions. And she said, we're fighting over $100 billion for loss and damage fund. And so to put things in perspective and stick to our commitments. Thank you for that. I want to bring back the panelists and perhaps to reflect on what you're hearing from the audience, and also share your own thoughts of kind of what should be prioritized moving forward, whether that be part of what we saw in the roadmap, because within that roadmap coming out of the Paris Summit, there were so many different suggestions. And so within this wide range of things, what should be the center of gravity in terms of the focus, and any other thoughts around ideas around climate swaps or innovative finance that have been touted as a solution. So if I can bring you all back on stage, so to speak, and turn to you, Heidi, first, to react either to anything you're hearing from the crowd or for your own thoughts on kind of where the priorities lie moving forward, and maybe why some of the solutions are not all they've been cracked up to be. I'm afraid you're on mute again.
Okay, there you go. So I kept unmuting, then I think the technical team were muting me back, and then I would unmute them. And then
you're good to go now. We can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. No, I think, just want to say thank you for the contributions from the floor. It's really great to hear other voices in this space and to sort of broaden out the debate. I think that, I completely agree with the speaker who mentioned sort of recognizing the elephant in the room in terms of colonialism, but also neo-colonialism, because actually colonialism didn't end when we saw countries become independent from their colonial powers. So there is definitely something in there about reparations, and you also mentioned a lot of the discussions around loss and damage have been framed as climate reparations. So I think that around the whole climate finance issue, we need to see, would be good for the Commonwealth Finance Ministers to prioritise this continued conversation at COP28, especially on the loss and damage fund, to ensure that that is properly operationalised, but also properly funded, so that we are talking, as Avinash mentioned earlier, we are talking about grants and not loans coming from the new sort of loss and damage fund that was announced last year, but also on the discussions around the new collective quantified goal. This is the new kind of target for climate finance post 2025, when the $100 billion a year goal expires. We need to see the Commonwealth Finance Ministers take part in these processes and advocate for adequate grant-based finance for global South countries to the tune of the trillions that we need, not the billions of dollars that we've seen up till now. And then the roadmap itself, mentions the G20 Common Framework a few times in very vague and foggy terms, but we do need to actually call on the Commonwealth Finance Ministers to call on the G20 to strengthen the common framework, so that we do see what's called comparability of treatment, where private creditors are having to give at least the same favorability of terms that bilateral creditors are giving, and also to open up their eligibility to all countries that need debt restructuring. They can also support legislation in key jurisdictions like the UK to enforce the participation of private creditors in debt negotiations. And in the long run, I think we need the Commonwealth Finance Ministers to actively support and work towards a UN debt workout mechanism in order to create an independent, fair and responsive process that is inclusive of all creditors, to ensure that the debt restructuring that is needed by countries that are in a debt crisis can actually take place in a fair and independent way.
I'm interested in your thoughts on strengthening the common framework. Grieve, you have said and written that in the case of Zambia, it would have been a lot faster for Zambia to just negotiate directly with its creditors than to try to go through this multilateral framework that the G20 set up. And so as we look at the way forward, would you agree that strengthening the common framework is a priority, or are there other areas in which the international community should be focused?
The common framework writ large for the world is, I think I'm with Heidi here, right? That essentially the principle of having an effective multilateral system to timelessly resolve debt is something we need to work towards too. But then there's the case of Zambia. So Zambia is a guinea pig here, right? So the world has learned lessons from Zambia, and that's a good thing. But that's called comfort for Zambians, right, who had to wait 2 years. I think it's important for one to make that kind of distinction, that we do need an effective multilateral system for resolving debt. On the other hand, we also need to understand the reason why these countries end up borrowing in the first place. Some of it we've talked about already, right? Why do they borrow? Why do they borrow from private creditors in such a reckless way at high interest rates? Those are the questions we need to confront ourselves with. And I think, again, we go back to the conversation that we started this discussion with, right? The World Bank is not doing its job, right? We need to have a World Bank that can crowd out private creditors so that they're not even, they're there, but they should be marginal insofar as who's lending to Zambia is concerned, right? In the very same way that we have in country, we have development banks, that are essentially responsible for long-term financing. They're essentially responsible for what economists call market failures in terms of lending, fixing those market failures, right? Going places where the private sector won't go to kickstart kind of development. Those are the things I think we need to be working towards too. And I want to make one last point, I think, which was made by one of the contributors, I think Ms. Akwe, I forget her first name, but she made a very important point about colonialism, also an important point about there is a lot of money in Africa, for example, but this money is spirited away, right? We have a lot of raw materials, we have a lot of Western multinationals that are applying their trade there, but they don't pay taxes, right? They use all this clever accounting, they use all this kind of stuff that allows them to hide their taxes, hide this money in tax havens, which means, we then don't have money to actually engage in long-term development financing. The former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, chaired a very important committee the Africa, I forgot what it was called, but it was an illicit financial flows panel of the Africa Union. They estimated, and I think conservatively there, that $50 billion per annum is spirited away from Africa in terms of tax avoidance, tax evasion, and all these kinds of things. Imagine, Heba, what we could do if we close that loophole, if we could close and plug that gap, right? Maybe we could go a long way towards really truly reforming the global financial architecture. So I think the ministers of finance that are going to convene soon should apply their minds to some of these issues, right? Really thinking about truly global development banks, thinking truly about helping us fix some of these tax loopholes. And yes, maybe the common framework. And again, it's important to make the distinction. I'm not against the common framework. I'm for multilateral processes towards debt resolution. But in the case of Zambia, as a guinea pig, we were completely failed by the process.
I just want to come back to, because a lot of the discussion that we've been having today are things that are in the hands of powerful countries to change. And the Commonwealth is mostly actually countries that were formerly colonized, and thus are poor countries that are not as well positioned to be able to make these kinds of changes. So what is the specific role of this group of nations, do you think, in some of what we've been discussing?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, Heba, and I think I have a lot of hope in the Commonwealth, surprisingly so, given that it's born out of the legacy of colonialism. But be that as it may, I think the fact that it's one of the few, groupings where we have a global South dominance, I think there's power there and there's opportunities there for organizing, mobilizing, articulating, and I think that's how I see it. We have common experiences. The experience of colonialism, the experience of neocolonialism, as Heidi put it, but also the experience of trying to develop in today's world. So I think therein is the strength for the Commonwealth. Therein is the strength for the Commonwealth to make arguments about new types of institutions, perhaps even to go so far as argue as to set up a development bank, a Commonwealth Development Bank, right?
Now there's a clear recommendation. Set up a Commonwealth Development Bank. I'm going to come back to the audience, and then we'll end with a few final remarks from the panel. So Ulrich Trutz, if I can now turn to you, please unmute yourself.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I've posted something in the chat, basically to cut down on the amount of time. But it's in keeping with this whole idea of Commonwealth action, basically more funds in the GCF Adaptation Fund, GEF, easier access to those funds, and finally, the opportunity for the Commonwealth to take the lead, help our countries basically to translate our NDCs, NAPs, which are for all extent just expressions of intent, translate them into portfolios for investment projects. And then look at Commonwealth investment in adaptation and mitigation. We start with the easy one, in mitigation. Commonwealth Fund basically to help with the transformation of the energy sector and for transition to net zero status. That's a good investment. The Commonwealth, don't forget, we have every shade of opinion there. Developed countries, BRICS, OPEC, SIDS, least developed countries, etc. We have the opportunity basically to take leadership to show how basically we could move forward. And I think this is one thing the Commonwealth shouldn't only do advocacy at the global level, but look at itself and to see what are the strengths and the opportunities really to push this agenda forward. Thank you.
Very interesting to hear. And I must admit that even as someone who was born in a Commonwealth country, I never really thought of the Commonwealth as such a strong force today. So it's great to see that the spirit is alive and well. Isaac Evans, France, over to you.
Special drawing rights are an IMF resource that were released 2 years ago and were the largest release of these financial resources in the history of the institution. And it was the result of civil society organizations from around the world advocating for years for them to be released. these special drawing rights don't have to be, they don't have to be paid back. They're not loans, and they don't have any strings attached. There are no conditionalities. So this is a way that countries can get resources rapidly in a very efficient way to help make financial space for dealing with the impact of the climate crisis. And in fact, over 50 civil society organizations from the Caribbean just wrote a letter this month to President Biden urging for his support at the IMF for another release of these resources. So I wanted to encourage folks to continue to advocate for the release of special drawing rights.
Thank you, Isaac. Very clear. Hemsing Harinag.
I believe I am very much for this idea of coming from grief that we should have a development bank of the Commonwealth Foundation, right? Because this is very interesting. It works at national level in most countries. And I believe it should work because we are developing new ideas. We have got more ideas than we had before. So this is one. But number two is what I'm not very happy about the conditions, the way that IFIs fund projects for certain countries. I say for certain countries. In many countries, mostly developing countries, you've got governments who do borrow funds from abroad for political reasons, for projects likely to bring in political gains. But most of these projects are not viable, right? They do not bring in the expected, let's say, refundable or reimbursable money. And yet governments do it just for political reasons, right? Because they find it very interesting, and it is also easy to tell people this is what we are doing for the poor or for the country. But in fact, these are toxic debts. These are onerous debts.
So what do you recommend, Hemsing?
So I'm saying that development banks or IFIs should be more serious in considering giving funding to nations, to governments, and should have more control, much more, let's say, monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly follow-up, right, to see that governments who have borrowed are going according to plans.
Thank you very much. And I know that some of you in the chat have noted your hands up, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to everyone today. I did save Avinash and Unime for last because I wanted your perspective listening to these suggestions and having been in governments of Commonwealth countries on which you think are palatable or realistic. And then we'll do a quick roundup of your own final recommendations. So, Unime, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you. I really interested in discussion, and I think it speaks to the heart of why we are here having this discussion. Probably spoiling the room. Finance ministers can only prioritize what they understand. And really that is it. And the climate change is an economic issue. We agree on that. But it hits at the heart of our development, and that's what we hear coming out in this conversation. And therefore, I think it is time for us to merge the agenda, to have this one-track discussion. We cannot continue to have the discussions in parallel tracks, which continue to happen, where finance ministers go off and meet in one direction, and the development people in the negotiations and so like myself go off and have this discussion, and then we try to merge them in forum like this. It's not working anymore. I think if we are to make meaningful progress, to reform the agenda, to build, as I like to call it, the cathedral, the financial architecture, then we have to start somewhere of having these honest, merge conversation, and then we branch out. I think we are attacking the problem from the outside when we should be attacking it from the inside. And so while the Commonwealth, and I think I'll go directly to the heart of the Commonwealth, we are Commonwealth, we are from Commonwealth nations, so we are Commonwealth citizens. And therefore, we want the Commonwealth to work. It needs this collective power to push from the inside. And I think that's what we can, that's really where our strength lies. This architecture, this financial architecture that we are speaking about needs a push from the inside. And it is only the people, I come back to the people of the Commonwealth that can make it happen. Not the finance ministers alone, not the climate negotiators alone, not the journalists like yourself alone, but everybody together, coming together with this collective action that is required. And then I think we will have progress. But the conversation here this morning has been so rich. But I think the system change that we require, this devolution of the architecture that is required, we're still not hitting the button in the right place.
Avinash, what are your reactions?
It's been a very rich discussion. I think this notion that, we need to put people at the center, it's partly a misunderstanding in the sense that there is no separation between development and finance. There is no separation between development and economics, because we need finance to do development. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in health. We need to invest in livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods. That costs money. That's why we need the finance and economics. Indeed, in the negotiations, as Uname says, the separation of these tracks is a deliberate effort by rich countries to actually make sure that we're talking about development with people who don't have any money, so that it never goes no further than that. But I think that, and I think the second point I'd make, though, is that whilst the historic injustices are critical, and we have a moral duty to keep the memory of those clear, and to talk about and to size the reparations. We have no way of compelling rich countries to pay any of that. When the UNESCO, recognized Palestine, what happened? The US started defunding UNESCO. So this notion that they owe us and we can sit here and wait for it, I think we need to make sure the memory is there, but they are not going to send us any money. And building a strategy that's based around me telling them that they owe us it's just, they're not even funding their health systems. Their own people are dying in their public health systems. Their own people don't get unemployment benefits, don't get social security. They're cutting back all of those things. And we think they're going to send us hundreds of billions of dollars? That's insane. And I think it's actually irresponsible, to be honest, because our people need something today. Our people need something to eat today and tomorrow and next year. But let me talk about something else.
Avinash, we're at time, so I'm going to take your broader
one
point.
final thing. Okay,
yes.
That if we are going to change the system, it's actually because there's no point canceling debt if you need to borrow again. Okay, that's the problem. But if we're going to change the system, we're going to change the fundamental economics. And let me leave with one idea. The current system puts all the value in production in the owners of capital, which they own. And they've stolen it, but they own it. We need to shift that. So, for example, bans on raw material exports is a way of shifting the balance between capital, raw material, and labor. We need to shift that balance for development. And fiddling around with, if you cancel debt on private creditors, they aren't going to lend to you. So if you need their money, you can't do that. It's the ability to do that is limited. What we need to do is change the underlying structure. And I think the way to do that is through trade and through economics, not actually through finance and debt. There's a limit to what we can do there if we don't change the fundamental economic system.
So if you can turn that into your one sentence recommendation that if you had to pick one thing to put before the finance ministers, how would you word that?
Ban on raw materials.
Okay, there we go. Unime, what's yours?
We have to concentrate on both access and delivery of climate finance for climate vulnerable countries. Both are important.
Brief.
I'm torn in so many sentences, but I'll go with one that was suggested by an audience member. Form a borrowers club. Get together as a borrowers club. There's power in numbers.
Bridgetown's happy to host it.
And Heidi, your one recommendation.
I think my one recommendation would be to change the balance of power between creditors and debtors. And one concrete way to do that would be to introduce legislation in key jurisdictions that would compel private lenders from holding out on debt negotiations. And it would also change the incentives in the system.
This has been eye-opening, and as many of you have said, very rich. I know we didn't get to everyone who wanted to speak. Luckily, there is a networking or working session for the next 15 minutes for any of you who want to join. So those who weren't able to share their recommendations in plenary can do so. You'll be put into breakout groups. So you can either follow the link that will be put into the chat, or follow the QR code that will be on a slide, and then you can continue the conversation. Just a few points to wrap up. This, as you know, is one of the series of the Commonwealth Foundation's Critical Conversations. The next will be on November 21st, which marks the halfway point to the next Commonwealth People's Forum and Heads of Government meeting in Samoa in 2024, where they will be discussing how civil society and governments can accelerate action, as we've been urging for, on climate justice, health justice, freedom of expression, and Commonwealth reform. So that's on the 21st of November. Also, if you have not already signed up, you can join the Foundation's digital discussion platform. It's called the People's Forum, and it's an online discussion space for activists, practitioners, artists, civil society leaders to network and share ideas and build solidarity around the issues we've been discussing today. If you want to keep up with the New Humanitarian and the news and analysis that we're providing, both on the impacts of climate change, but on reforms that are needed at the global governance level, you can sign up to our daily or weekly digests at thenewhumanitarian.org/subscribe. And I also mentioned the podcast in which we have been reimagining global governance. It's called Rethinking Humanitarianism, and you can find it anywhere you find your podcasts. And finally, to continue the conversation, you can join us on social media at Commonwealth.org and at New Humanitarian. Thank you so much to all of you for your inputs and thoughts. I know there are a range of opinions, and I think it's a very healthy part of the process to air them out and interrogate them. So thank you for doing that today. And for those joining the networking session, please go ahead to the Zoom link shared now, or scan the QR code on the screen. And thank you very much, and goodbye.